harmony, by the way, with the new commandment that Jesus gave us in John 13. A couple of verses there. You don't need to turn there. I'll read them to you. You probably remember these, though. Jesus said in John 13, listen, He said, "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another." Remember that? "Even as I have loved you, that you also love one another." And He said, "By this all men will know that you're disciples of mine, how if you have love for one another." You see, not if you say, "I'm one of your disciples." It's if you act it out, if you live it out. So be sure you see here that our imitation of God and the authentication of our claim that we make every day to be His children, this begins with our imitation of Christ's sacrificial love for us. So we're to walk in love. There's a second instruction in this passage for becoming imitators of God that you need to see. Second thing that we're to do is we're to walk in purity. Live our lives in purity. Now, let me give you a very basic principle here, a very crucial truth that you need to understand. God is holy, and as a result of God's holiness, God hates sin. It's true. God is holy. He's pure. And God's expectation is that purity and not sin will characterize the lives of His followers, the lives of His children. You see, that may not seem completely fair to you, but it's the way that it is. It's the expectation that God places on you. God is pure, and He demands that you be pure too. Look at verses 3 and 4. Look at 3 for starters here. Now take this in. He says, "But immorality, or any impurity or greed must not even be named among you, as is proper among saints." 3 words there, I think, require a little bit of explanation. What is immorality? Well, you might guess, and you probably would be right if you were to do this. Immorality is a reference to sexual sin. Classical Greek, it had reference to really 3 things: fornication, prostitution, and homosexuality. We don't need to stand on that in any greater detail because that really covers everything. Obviously, the big term there is fornication. Let me define fornication for you. Really, that is a comprehensive term that forbids Christians from being involved in any kind of sexual sin. Sexual sin of any kind, I don't care what the circumstance is not conducive to living a life that imitates God. Must not even be named among you, see. Second thing that cannot even be named among you is impurity. Impurity, similar sounding word, but really it's a more general term in the Greek. It refers to defilement of all kinds. Paul uses the word any to modify that. Impurity underscores that. And so what is impurity? Well, it might be drunkenness, might be debauchery really of any kind that has as the result unrestrained fleshly behavior. And then finally, if we're going to imitate God, we cannot be greedy, right? Greed is best understood as a selfishness that really occupies an extreme degree. When we hear greed, we have a tendency only to think of money. But this, I think, is a broader term than that, the way that it's used here. Really what Paul is preaching against, what he's condemning here, is self-centeredness. Now, there's none of that goes on in God's church today, is there? No self-centeredness. You see, it's that simple. Coveting or any kind of lust or any kind of placing yourself above anybody else, that's greed. And it's prohibited here. This is just a comprehensive kind of an overview. The point is that so vital is the believer's pursuit of purity and his imitation of God that he simply cannot do these things. These classes of sins should be so far removed from the Christian's thinking that he won't even give place to them in conversation. This very point that our speech also must be pure is taken up by Paul in verse 4. Look at 4. And there must be no filthiness and silly talk, no coarse jesting. These things are not fitting, but rather there must be the giving of thanks. Filthiness is probably, again, just what you would imagine it to be. It's general obscenity. It's foul speech of any kind, cursing. I've had people tell me that the Bible doesn't speak against cursing. Yes, it does. Degrading slander. All of these things would file underneath this heading of filthiness. Paul says there must be no filthiness. Must also be no silly talk. Silly talk is derived from a Greek word that means dull or stupid. This might be speech that exists among Christians that would attract or that would detract from the faith, that would jeopardize their testimony. We're not prohibiting fun here, having fun. Just saying be careful. And finally, coarse jesting is also prohibited here. And this is a reference, I think, almost certainly to humor that's in bad taste. Distasteful, unacceptable jokes. Sarcastic ridicule. Things that are really designed to demean people. These are all prohibited. And in place of these, Paul then turns proactive as he says that as a believer, if you're an imitator of God, the right thing to do is to continually give thanks, right? It's to edify with your speech. It's to build up. Luke chapter 6, verse 45, you might remember this. Jesus said, it's a great statement. Jesus said that the mouth speaks from that which, guess what? That which fills the heart. In other words, the mouth says what? The mouth says what the heart tells it to say. It says what the mind tells it to say. And so the question then is, what's your heart full of? Listen to your words, and you'll know what your heart is filled with. First instruction for becoming imitators of God then is to walk in love. The second instruction is to walk in purity. The third instruction from our passage, we'll cover this quickly, for becoming imitators of God is to walk in wisdom. It's to walk wisely in life. That's what verses 6 through 17 remind us of. These verses tell us that we need to live careful lives. Ephesian Christians had mostly been saved out of a pagan background. They had a lot in common with Americans today. It was a pagan country. This is now a pagan country. They had been saved from paganism, and probably many of them still had relationships with friends and family who were still in the culture, still in the world, just like we today. This is all a salient observation to observe here, to see here, especially given the obvious similarities between that first century pagan Greek culture and our own. We live in a sinful, decadent culture too, and we're saved sinners with loved ones still sold out to sin in the culture. And so what Paul really wants to do here is he wants us to understand that we must not again be enslaved. We must not again be ensnared by sin. He wants us to remember where we've been. He wants us to remember that that is a clear and still a present danger. And so he says, walk wisely, and he gives these three directions for walking in wisdom. To live careful lives, to avoid being re-ensnared by sin, and in order to live out this good testimony. Three things that you must do. To walk wisely, to walk in wisdom, first of all, you must be mindful of the danger of clinging to sin. 6, let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. What is Paul supposing there? Look at that verse. He's supposing that to these Christians who he was writing to, there were voices that were maybe outside the church, hopefully outside the church, maybe some within the church, who were coming to them and saying, don't take that Christian stuff so seriously. Have some fun. Compromise some. You see, there were people in the act of deceiving them in that way, and Paul says, let no one deceive you with empty words. Compromise is not acceptable to God. Sin is always a very serious matter with the Lord. He's reminding the believers, he's reminding us, Paul is, that we must not be deceived into believing that God is ever tolerant of sin. He's not. To walk wisely means to be mindful of the danger of clinging to sin in any way. Secondly, to walk in wisdom, you have to be resolved to live out your faith deliberately. Deliberately. In other words, don't stagger through life. That's so common as Christians today. We become saved and then we just kind of aimlessly stagger through life, and we present ourselves as an easy target for the devil and his schemes. We need to live life deliberately. And the next several verses tell us how to do that. We'll just read through these. Look at 7. Don't be partakers again with the sons of disobedience. Stop acting like unbelievers. That's pretty simple. For you were formerly darkness, that is formerly like them, but now you're light in the Lord, and so walk as children of light. Walk as believers, right? Live like Christians. How do you do that? We'll look at verse 10. You do that by learning what is pleasing to the Lord. How do you learn what's pleasing to the Lord? Well, you take in this book. Don't participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead even expose them. It's disgraceful even to think of the things which are done by them in secret. But now look at 13. Know this. All things become visible when they're exposed by the light, for everything that becomes visible is light. You need to live out your faith deliberately. Stop aimlessly wandering through life. Make it the thing that you live for. Get out of bed and think about how you can proactively live as a child of God. And finally, to walk in wisdom as imitators of God, Paul says, redeem all of the time that the Lord gives you. Redeem every single moment. Don't reserve any time for yourself. Let me say that again. Do not reserve any time for yourself. Your time is not your own. Your time is God's time. He wants you to live for Him all the time. These next few verses, 15, therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time because the days are evil. So then do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Who are you living for? What are you living for? That's a pretty clear instruction. To walk in wisdom ultimately is to live for God. Let's have that reformation. We really don't have any control over what goes on in the culture. We don't have any control over what goes on outside these walls. Individually, we really don't have any control over what goes on that's outside of our own lives. But it's time for us to have a modern reformation. We need to reclaim this calling. We need to understand that God calls us to imitate Him in all things. And the really great news is that we can do it.